Okay, welcome to another virtual lecture. Before we start, I hope everybody appreciate my new sexy PowerPoint template that matches the topic. Thank you. That I stole from whatever this website is. So obviously we're going to talk a little bit about crime and the news media. It's something a lot of people have brought up already. I think the tendency when people say media and crime, they leap to news media anyway. So we're going to hit it dead on today. Why it matters? Most of you, like a few of you in the forums, already brought up why it matters. When we think about how much crime there is and people's perception about how much crime there is, when you ask them about their neighborhood, and we have a ton of survey research on this, when you say, do you feel safe in your neighborhood? How much crime is? Usually, their perception is based on their own experience and their word of mouth. So if they tend to live in a safe neighborhood, they report they live in a safe neighborhood. But when you talk about, what do you think of crime in your city, or what do you think of crime in the country? Um, People tend not to have direct experience with that, so they tend to rely on mostly news media for their reports on crime. And so two and three, two and three, 3 and 4 Americans tend to get their crime from daily TV or daily newspapers. And folks have brought this up in the forum. They're like, "Oh, my parents watch news all the time, and they'd be pretty shocked to know that crime's going up or crime's actually going down." So it matters because when you don't have direct experience with something, people rely on the news. The belief is they're getting the sort of unvarnished facts, and in a way they are. I mean, the media is not making up what they cover; they're just sort of choosing to cover certain things. Um, so what do they choose to cover? In general, if you look at newspapers and television news, crime tends to be a pretty big topic. In the 90s, it was the #1 topic on most network TV news and in a lot of newspapers. Um, you think about it, it consumed up to almost a third of local TV news time, right? So you think about local TV, news, weather, sports, all the stuff on there, 30% of it was dedicated to some sort of crime information. And I've used this stat before. There's a really interesting piece of research that found that as crime was declining in the 90s, and especially homicide, coverage of homicide was increasing dramatically at the same time. Um, in terms of sort of more recent research, that was the point of the Wenger and Daly article. They're reporting the results of a 1 month study of several local newspapers. And it's a really good study. One of the things you find is that there's a lot of variation in how much coverage there is. So the lowest one in 1 month was 26 crime stories, and the highest one was 165 crime stories in 1 month. It works out to about 2 to 3 local crime stories per day. And then you add in, if there's any national news, sort of celebrity crimes, other stuff. It also pops up because it's a lot of times in a lot of newspapers, it's sort of the front page news. If you're talking about like, television news, it's the lead story or the one that gets the most time. Why? Editors, and that's also came up in that same article, is that people people read it. People listen, they tune in when you talk about it. If you're talking about social media, what news links people click, they tend to click the ones that are certain sorts of crime. So the main point is that crime in general has always sort of been a main topic of news media. Um, we talk about the Daily Sun, which was like a tabloid newspaper. It started in the 1800s, and one of the things they found is that they put this crime blotter in that just was a list of crimes that occurred, and almost immediately circulation went up. Um, so there's a lot of crime coverage in the news. The other issue is sort of, all right, well, what kind of crime, what kind of coverage are we talking about? The Winger and Daly article is pretty typical of what's found, and that is that most to all of the coverage are what's called episodic or event. So a crime happened. Here's the facts. Here's the suspect. Here's what happens to them. That sort of stuff. They're written from police reports or from the initial police discussion of the crime in the media. And the other sort of big issue is the sorts of crimes that tend to get reported. So crime's happening everywhere, always, and news people pick out which crimes to report. One of the big sort of things that always gets missed is that the type of crime reported is almost always street crime. Um, Very rarely do you see any sort of white collar crime, unless, I mean, the exception is when it gets reported, it tends to get reported in the business section, not in the local or national sections of the newspaper. That in itself, makes when people think about crime, they think about, muggings and not sort of insider trading and corporate fraud and Medicaid, Medicare abuse and those sorts of things. But even then, so I mean, the first cut is it's street crime, not sort of sweet crime. The second is it's a very particular sort of street crime, and as Surratt points out, it's often the law of opposites. So by far, property crime is much more common than violent crime. So property crime leads violence. I think the ratio is like 9-to-1. For every one violent crime, there's 9 property crimes. What gets reported is the opposite, that for every one property crime, there's 4 reports of violence. And in particular, the media reports a lot of homicides, right? The old news saying is, if it bleeds, it leads. And so, homicide makes up 0.2% of all crime, of all arrests for crime, and it makes up 35% of news coverage of arrests for crime. So, obviously, that leads to people when they think about crime, they think about violence. When they think about violence, they think about homicide. By far, what's the most common form of violence? It's assault. It's a simple assault where nobody gets hurt. So the other issue, the other sort of distortion that's out there is in terms of victims. The media tends to try to find the most vulnerable victim they can, so that the reader gets emotionally attached, they empathize. So there's a couple studies that found the most common victim of crime reported in the news are affluent white female female victims. And again, law of opposites. Who's most likely to be criminal? Inner city, urban, rural, non-white, young kid. The other issue is stranger versus acquaintance. By far, almost every crime, I think the only exception is mugging, robbery. But other than that, by a pretty wide margin, most crimes are crimes amongst people who know each other. You think about child sexual abuse. I mean, when people hear, sex abuse, pedophile, immediately you think of like creepy dude driving the panel van, right? But 90% of that sort of crime against kids is by people they know. It's not by a creepy stranger guy. It's by trusted family friend, relative, or the parents themselves. And the other thing that this is sort of obvious, right? That if there's something odd or extreme or salacious about a particular crime, or it's done by a celebrity, it gets reported. So I'm trying to think of who the most recent sort of out of control celebrity is, and I can't. Somebody could post up on the blog if you on the forum if you can think of it. All I can think of is Justin Bieber and a couple other people that are sort of past their celebrity status. Again, why? Because people read it. It's something that piques their interest. In Duluth, we have the famous ball slasher. It's a dude that has mental issues with respect to sexual gratification, and he's sort of come to associate ripping apart those big rubber exercise balls with sexual gratification, and so he's broken into a number of places, including, I think, UMD, to get at those exercise balls and slash them with knives. That sort of crime is so weird and odd that the news media reports it because people find it sort of interesting. That said, what happens is young reporters get trained by editors to find, quote, newsworthy sorts of crimes. And a great sort of, it's an exaggeration, but it's a sort of satire of the industry. It's a very creepy movie. We might watch it at the end of this class. But the movie Nightcrawler, and it's a guy that he becomes one of those dudes that chases around crime with a scanner, tries to get news footage and then sell it to the police station. And there's a great scene where the news editor is talking about what they want. They want crime, they want blood, they want violence, and they don't want it in some crappy non-white neighborhood. They want it in the white suburbs so that people will get excited about it. So There's a lot of crime going on, and the sort of crime picked out to report by the news media is very particular and oftentimes sort of the exact opposite of the most common. They're looking for the uncommon. So violence over property, homicide over other violence, stranger homicide over something like a domestic assault that ends up in the death of somebody. So the image, obviously, of crime that's in there becomes pretty distorted. Why does crime and that particular sort of crime end up in the news so often? I think the tendency is to sort of blame and demonize the media, but keep in mind, crime sells, right? Which means you guys and myself and your parents, and we think about what links do you click on Facebook or other social media. I mean, are you going to click on one that says, like, John Smith shoplifted a pack of cigarettes from the gas and slurp? No. Like, crazy dude slashes women with a knife on a subway? Yeah. So, part of it's on us. The other reasons, one of the big reasons that there's such a good fit between crime and news organizations is it's just the bureaucracy of news and reporting news and the needs of news. And the biggest one is that need to fill a news hole. Or you think every day you're putting out a print newspaper. Every day you have to have articles and articles to fill up the newspaper. And so you're looking for essentially filler. And crime is super elastic in the sense that, in the whole world, there's always a ton of crime. And there's always going to be a homicide somewhere in the world every single day. And so it is the great sort of newspaper filler. All those little articles that are in the bag. There's a great study to look at that where those little short criminal event articles were, and they tended to be near the obituary section. Why the obituary? Because obituaries are totally unpredictable. You don't know how many people are going to die and how big the obituary is going to be. And so that space every day is going to jump around, and sometimes you're going to need more filler and sometimes not. So, I mean, and crime isn't the only filler, right? What else? Any kind of tragedy, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, any kind of tragedy and death attracts news attention. Beyond that simple fact, and I think that's the biggest one, is the idea that there's benefits to reporting crime per se. One of them is that there's a 1-to-1 ratio between sending out a reporter and getting a story. Right? If you know a crime occurred, you send a newspaper out there. They can take a picture of some crime scene. There's going to be witnesses, law enforcement, somebody to interview. There's going to be a story, and that's not always true, right? You send out a reporter for some other event or something that's going on. They may or may not find people to interview. They may or may not generate something interesting that people want to read about. But for crime, it's almost always results in a story. And the second is that story's pretty easy to report. Those criminal events, in a way, it's like a sporting event, right? Like, you can look at the box score of a baseball game and write up a short article on what happened in that baseball game. Who was the winning pitcher? How many innings did they pitch? Who got the big hit? Who drove in runs? In that sense, those criminal events, they get some kind of police report. And from that police report, they can write a pretty detailed story. And the police are oftentimes kind of keen to help and support the media because they want to be able to frame things, and media attention is part of what gets them resources when it comes to budget time. So I don't think it's like media being evil and the news media being evil as much as it is that crime sells, and crime's a really good fit bureaucratically for how newspapers run and what their needs are. So that's the sort of bureaucratic aspect. The more sort of conflict aspect, if you go back to that Robinson article, they talk about, right, they need money, and their big goal of all media is to make money, and that somebody like that concern is that when the news media especially gets centralized in a few small hands, they tend to present what he calls the dominant ideology, which goes back to, it's a little fancier way to say that they're preoccupied with street crime and certain forms of street crime and street crime that happens in certain neighborhoods. And in that sense, it's sort of who has the power and how are you using the power and what are you shining a light on and what are you not shining a light on. As with other media, crime news is socially constructed, and it's not to say that's a bad thing or an evil thing. It's that newspapers, a big part of what they do is in the news reporting is to sort of discover themes that are out there that they can write on, and so they will use crimes to develop these sort of news themes. They can run a series of stories. They can frame a crime in a certain way as another example of this. So I put a couple on the slides that are sort of current right now. You hear a lot of reporting, and people brought this up on the forum of opioids. There's an epidemic, and there's articles about people that get that OD. Like people should be equipped with Narcan, which is used to counteract overdoses, drug treatment, drug courts. There's a lot of ways you can take that, and they'll develop those sorts of themes. And that's common to every drug. Every illicit drug has had its heyday in terms of media coverage. But obviously, police brutality, police use of force, use of lethal force, Black Lives Matter, all those things are themes. And so if you think about how the media works and what they do, they're competing against each other. So if station A or newspaper A has this news theme on opioids, other people are going to say, "Well, I wonder if that's going on in my city," or we should cover it our own way. And they start looking for examples, right? Police brutality. Um, I can't think of the kid in Missouri. All I can think of is Trayvon Martin, but that was a Florida kid. So a couple big incidents that drew all kinds of media attention. And what's going to happen? Well, every news media source is going to be looking for sort of the next instance of that. So whether or not police shoot more people or less people, anytime it happens now, the media is going to be all over it because people are interested because it sort of fits that theme. They do link, right? So every drug scare, and the media will say, well, crack is, or methamphetamine is the new crack, right? Or they link one old drug with a new drug. I'll talk a bit more about that, and we talk about moral panics, which is the next topic. So crime can get constructed by news media in a couple ways. One is these sort of specific themes, and the other is that overall, and hopefully I've already painted this picture, is that news coverage in the U.S. and in most places, in general, sort of subtly offers a very specific construction of criminal events. That when we think of crime, we don't think of shoplifting. We think of murder, and we think of random, senseless murder. When you think of murder, the first thing probably doesn't leap to your mind is, a boyfriend and girlfriend that are both drunk off their ass that get in a fight, and the boyfriend pulls a gun and shoots. That's by far a lot more common than the sort of senseless violence that often gets reported. So the idea that street crime is the most important sort of crime, that by street crime we're talking about violent, random crime, especially homicides against affluent white women, and that law enforcement is sort of our best way to respond to crime. Law enforcement, because they're by far the most often source that's used by newspaper reporting. And so the media, the news media, like other media, are involved in socially constructing crime. So this is a classic article. I know it's old. Part I'm using it because it's old, because it's something that hasn't been talked to death about. It's not familiar to you folks, but I can remember. So this article sort of got a bunch of attention in the 80s when I was in school. People were still talking about it when I was in college. So I can remember I wrote a paper on granny bashing. I think that was the title of the paper, which the professor didn't really care for. But the article starts, they talk about, in 1976, New York City experienced a sort of crime wave of seniors getting mugged on the street. And there's a surge of newspaper reporting and coverage, and it lasted for almost 2 months. Drew national attention. Everybody's like, what's going on? How come these really young kids, it sort of echoes of that super predator stuff. How are these young kids beating up all our senior citizens? Isn't this horrible? And the local police department held meetings so that elderly people could come in and learn how to protect themselves. And there was a sort of real response in the sense that police departments set up the SCRU, the Senior Citizens Robbery Unit. They added more manpower. They had undercover people walking in the streets. There was legislative bills put forth to increase penalties against juveniles to make it more likely to waive juveniles in adult court. So people got whipped up into a frenzy about essentially folks mugging senior citizens. How did this happen? Fishman looks at it a couple different ways. He does a quantitative analysis. He looks at coverage in 2 local New York City newspapers and 1 television station to look and see, what happened with coverage over that time span. And he also does a sort of in-depth qualitative study of one particular news station to do these in-depth interviews and talk about how they do this coverage. What he finds is that prior to this sort of quote crime wave, elderly crime reporting was rare. You think about how big a city that is, that somewhere every day in that city, there's probably an elderly person getting mugged. What happened was that the Daily News started to cover it, and somebody put it together as a theme. They sort of put these crimes together and said, "Oh, there's this uptick of elderly abuse." Once that theme's created, what are they going to do? Like they're on the hunt, and police precincts are catering to that, so they're gonna sort of forward any events that happen to the news department. Then you can sort of expand that theme. You can talk about any crime that comes up that fits that. You send a reporter to the meeting with senior citizen. They sent reporters out on the beat with police officers, and so then the other news agencies have to compete, right? If one news agency is getting a bunch of attention and a bunch of readership or viewership because of that issue, you only get scooped. You're gonna start reporting that too. And so what happens is once that theme gets out there, all the news organizations, it's like a feeding frenzy. They're all trying to find examples. And like I said, in the big city, you can find examples like that. The pool of crimes is deep, and the relationship between news reporting agencies and police is pretty strong. And so the police help pick out, quote, newsworthy stories, in this case, the stories that help fit their theme. Ultimately, what he found is that it was this sort of one news station kicked it off, and everybody else piled on, and they created sort of out of thin air this crime wave. And like the previous side said, it did have sort of real consequences. They created these units. They went out in the streets. They had decoy people act as senior citizens. And the point is, if you sort of pointing, it's not that protecting senior citizens is bad, is that the actual crime didn't go up or down. It was just newspaper reporting that we end up responding to. And so you ask, like, what's the best policy use of our dollars? Is it paying for overtime for police to send out decoys and try to have stings to bust people that are going to mug elderly? So that's the point of assigning that particular article. The other sort of thing I want to touch on is that news reporting, it's been one of the it's sort of one of the biggest media or parts of the media that's changed dramatically in the last 20 years. And sort of the first thing that's well beyond 20 years ago was the advent of cable TV. Cable TV and the introduction of 24-hour news reporting is one of the big things that led to an increase of crime. You think about it, if you're a newspaper, you have to put out a newspaper every day. If you're cable TV, you have to fill every single hour of coverage with something. And so cable TV news, you're talking about the CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, across the spectrum, you have these channels that are sort of competing against each other to draw attention, and crime is an issue that works. The other thing has been that corporate consolidation, and so newsrooms have been one of the biggest parts that's just taken a beating. The introduction of the new media took away a good chunk of the advertising, right? A newspaper used to make a killing on classified ads, right? There's almost no classified ads anymore. Why? Because you can use Craigslist and eBay, and people can communicate directly rather than going through a newspaper to advertise. Um, and so newspapers, the other thing is you can read almost every newspaper without paying for it now, right? You go online, and so news organizations are struggling trying to figure out how to make money. And as they do so, these big corporations are gobbling up and consolidating and turning them into sort of chains, like a chain restaurant. Right? Gannett News owns tons of newspapers. And to sort of beef up profitability, they've gone to a more sort of tabloid style, more pictures, less words. If you pick up a New York Times from 100 years ago, there's almost no pictures in it. Really thick, in-depth articles. And if you look at a newspaper now, it's like a leaflet. And it's filled with all sorts of color ink and other stuff. So that's been a big change. The other change with the news, so what's happened is, newsrooms have shrank. That instead of having, 2 or 3 crime beat reporters, you may only have one that does also other things. And so the coverage now is not what it used to be. The other thing is the advent of the new media. There's always upsides and downsides. The upside is, you get a lot more raw information as a consumer. You think of police use of force, right? Well, now everybody can film it, everybody can upload it. You skip the traditional news media altogether. So the upside is you often get this unfiltered look at reality. The downside is that allows a lot of untruth to get reported as truth uncritically or unskeptically. And there's a lot of people that benefit from manipulating news to suit their needs, whether it's ideologically or for profit motive. You think of our last election and all of the fake news that was bouncing around all the social media sites in the last 2 weeks leading up to the election. People click on that link, and especially if it fits with their ideology to start with, they tend to believe what they read. And in that sense, there was a downside to the old media where a few large newspapers dominated everything, but the upside of that was you had editors that fact-checked everything and that made sure that the sources used in the article were credible and that the facts were actually facts, whereas now there's a lot less of that, right? These things get reported before anybody vets them. So in that sense, the nature, and there's obviously our current president hasn't done much to help the image of news media by calling, their big traditional newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, like fake news and not legitimate, and so on and so forth. So by any measure, journalism's in a bit of trouble right now, and that over time has also had an impact on news. What's the big picture here? The big picture is that there's obviously a misperception amongst Americans, and it happens in other countries, about crime. If you haven't done so, check out, there's a great little sort of satirical Australian thing on how crime gets reported in the news. But what happens? People think there's more crime than there is. They're sort of more willing to go with particular policies because of how crime's reported and how much. It increases fear of crime, and ultimately it can lead to public policy. And then the issue is, as I said earlier, could you have gotten more bang for your buck spending money some other way? That's especially important if you're responding to a crime wave that isn't a crime wave, as in that Fishman article. All right.